Ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here, and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. And here on the show today, we have the fabulous Robyn Purdy from our very own Aspect Legal. Robyn, welcome back on the show. I'm sure you're excited.
Thanks, Joe. Love being here. Always exciting to do podcasts with you.
Oh, don't lie. I love it. And today we are talking about tips and traps in IP ownership. And in particular, we're talking about this issue that has come up quite a bit lately from a number of perspectives, which we'll discuss, that relate to issues in validating the chain of title, i.e. who actually owns the intellectual property in your organisation. And maybe, Robyn, give us a quick snapshot of some of the issues that you've seen. And I'm going to throw in with some issues I've seen as well. So we'll start with maybe what the problem is, and then we'll get back. Then we'll move backwards and we'll talk about what intellectual property is and how we work out this whole chain of title thing. But let's start with some examples. So what problems have you seen on your desk, Robyn, recently?
I think, the first thing that we want to talk about when we're thinking about this chain of title is in light of IP assets, is we're dealing with really intangible assets. So if you were talking about chain of title for real estate, for example, it's very easy to track who was the owner, how did they become the owner, and you can see the historical sequence there. When you're talking about something intangible like copyright, however, it's very difficult to be able to put any sort of certainty around who the owner is if the proper documentation isn't there to support it. And one of the big problems that we see quite often is where you've engaged third parties to create content for you. For example, you might engage a design team to produce some creative content for your website. And, if in the absence of a really robust contractors agreement that deals with who the actual owner is, the default position is that the contractor would be the owner. And so then if you had a situation where the business owner wanted to sell their business and, part of the sale involved those IP assets, you potentially could have an issue where they're selling something that they're not actually the owner of.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this comes up for us in a number of ways. Obviously, we deal with a lot of clients at exit and, of course, in the acquisition phase. And this is something that we're really looking out for in the due diligence. So that's the investigation of businesses or companies that are being acquired by our clients or, as I said, acting for our clients who are exiting. So buyers, want to be sure that where the value in the organisation that they're acquiring is partly IP, or IP is a component of the value of that organisation they're acquiring, that they have clarity that the organisation actually owns that IP, and that it's not going to be subject to an infringement action into the future. But it's not just at exit or acquisition that we're thinking about this. It's also when organisations are bringing on new equity holders, new business partners, when they're looking for funding, so if they're after funding and they have to validate the value of the IP in their balance sheet.
Absolutely. It can also arise in situations where they're considering just internal restructuring. They're looking at creating IP holding entities or, trying to engage in some, creation of additional entities for asset protection reasons. And you want to make sure that you're transferring the IP from the right owner, into the holding company or, where you want it to ultimately land. But for that to be effective, it has to be the actual owner who's doing the transfer. So we, aside from the obvious instances in the sale and the acquisitions of businesses, this sorts of considerations about proper ownership of IP assets can just pop its head up in all sorts of environments.
Yeah, absolutely. So working back through some of the issues that we have seen, I think the reality here is quite often when there's a concern about clarity as to IP ownership. So, for example, let's use some hard examples here. Who actually owns the trademark or the brand name of an organisation? Who actually owns the source code that a business's whole website might be built on? And some businesses, the website and the development and the code that's part of that website are a large part of the value of the organisation. Obviously for tech companies. And where else do we see this coming up?
Well, we see it arising, in relation to copyright considerations as well, which is, apart from the source code on the website, but it's the actual content that sits on the website as well. Things like, for photographs, for example, you might have a situation where you've engaged a photographer to provide those photographs for you, and you put them on your website. So, you sell your website as part of your business sale or whatever the case may be. And, those photographs are sitting there. If we haven't established that you are the actual owner of the photographs, potentially, down the track, the photographer may have a claim there for intellectual property infringement.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's about going back and understanding, I guess what we really need to do is go back to that point of creation of the intellectual property. And the problem is sometimes the creation of that intellectual property can be back a long time. It can be back decades. Absolutely. Sometimes.
And you may have a situation where it was created by somebody, a natural person who's now passed. You may have a situation where it was created by an organisation that's been dissolved for some reason. And so trying to plug the holes in, the gaps of chain of title or the ownership problem is not always going to be an easy thing to achieve, which is why we want to be turning our minds to it, as soon as possible when we're talking about IP creation to make sure that, we're starting out in the best way possible.
Okay, brilliant. So, look, I guess we've traversed what the problems are that we've seen on our desks. Quite often, it's actually a regular basis that we're dealing with these questions, whether it's, part of due diligence, investigating the value of the assets that are being purchased, whether it's getting a business ready for exit or dealing with their own due diligence responses, whether it's preparing a business for growth, whether it's preparing a business for funding or just dealing with some internal hostilities within an organisation, say, for example, with its, its owners or its contractors or people who have developed the IP. So we've talked about the problems. Maybe let's go back and establish some of the background. So firstly, I think I'd like to just traverse what is intellectual property. So what are we talking about here? And what is chain of title? Because I've just realised that we're using this word, this phrase chain of title, and it may not have the same meaning to our listeners as it does to us. So let's start with intellectual property. What are the things that we're talking about here? And we gave some examples before, but let's sort of run through it.
I mean, typically when you're talking about intellectual property, you're talking about goodwill and your brand. So you think about the things that are making up your brand. It could be trademarks, both registered or unregistered trademarks. You've obviously got designs, and in some case you might have registered patents as well. But we're also talking about, as you sort of referred to, website content, source code. It's really the intangible assets, things that you can't physically touch with your hand that we're thinking of when we're talking about IP or intellectual property assets.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess one thing to point out with intellectual property is that the thing with intellectual property is the intangibility of
That's
it.
Right.
And so this concept of who is the creator is such an important concept that doesn't come up when we're thinking about elements that are real property, physical property.
That's right.
So, and I think it's also useful if we separate apart the concept of authorship versus economic rights. So maybe if you can talk a little bit, Robyn, about that distinction in the world of intellectual property between authorship and the economic rights?
Sure. I mean, I think the best way to probably talk about that is just to illustrate it with some hard examples. When we're talking about authorship, what we're really speaking is about the person who's created it, the actual inventor, the writer of the content, the photographer, really the author of the creative work, the IP in question. And then when you're talking about economic rights, it's, well, who did that author create the work for? Who's going to take the benefit in terms of using that creation? So typically you're going to an ad company and they're creating, an advertisement or some marketing content for you. They're the creators or the authors of the work. But you as the business is the one that's going to be profiting and gaining the economic benefit of that creative content.
But here's the rub, isn't it? That if you want to be the economic hold the economic rights, i.e. you want to hold the copyright moving forward for the rights to make decisions about the use of the work that's being created and the ability to use it in a monopoly way, i.e. to stop the creative agency here in this example from going and using components of it with someone else. You need that assigned to you. And what we're really investigating when we're looking at chain of title, and we'll go back and explain that meaning in a second, what we're really investigating here, isn't it, is where and when did that assignment occur from the author to the person who ultimately holds the copyright, the economic rights associated with it.
Yes.
And in that sense, that's what we're really trying to shore up, and sometimes there's a lack of clarity, isn't there?
There is. And sometimes you can have more than one owner as well. It's not always clear cut. You can have parties collaborating on the creation. And so then it may be a case that there is more than one person or entity that is the proper owner of the content. Or, you're looking at something like a website and you think about the various components that make up the website. And you may have copywriters, you may have photographers, and you may be writing content yourself, and you may be using the intellectual property of a third party under some sort of licensing arrangement. You've engaged software engineers to write source code for you. So there's obviously lots of different components involved there. There's going to be lots of different owners of each of those components as well. And so the example I gave is really the default position of where we're starting at. And what we want to do is try and make sure that if we do have a situation where the author is different to the party that's going to be deriving the economic benefit, that we want to make sure that we've got that assignment in place so that we can say going forward that the author no longer has the right to use that IP. We don't want them being able to give that copy to one of our competitors, for example.
Absolutely. So going back, and then let's also define chain of title. Maybe, Robyn, if you can sort of let our listeners know, what is it that we are talking about?
What is it?
Talking about chain of title, those bloody lawyers with their jargon.
The legal jargon, in this instance, there's not a statutory definition that we turn to, but when we're talking about chain of title, what we're really thinking of is the historical sequence, establishing ownership of the asset from the present owner back to the original owner. And this can, be thought of as maybe a series of documents or agreements that prove the ownership rights of the asset. So we're tracing the ownership back to who created it in the beginning to be able to establish how we own it now.
And we were doing some prep work on one of our clients recently, and I think I commented to you that I felt like we were almost detectives.
It is very, absolutely. It starts with, a really thorough audit of talking to our clients. Okay, we're talking about the website. So we want to know, when did it come into existence? How did it come into existence? Whose idea was it? And what happened after you had the idea? Who did you go and speak to? Who helped you? So it's very much a detective job there that we dive right in and untangle the history of how these things came about. A lot of people have these beautiful logos associated with their business. How did that logo come into existence?
And to be clear, I guess, some people listening to this might say, well, I don't know, that just sounds full on for all of the elements of IP in our business. I guess the point is what we're doing here is we're seeking to find where is the value in your business? What makes the value in your business? Now, and if a critical component of that is intellectual property, then it's important that you can prove the chain of title, like prove that your organization is the owner of that value, those rights, that asset.
Absolutely.
And maybe if we talk about, I guess, the difference between physical assets and intangible assets, I guess for physical assets, the reality is the real difference is for physical assets, it's generally fairly easy to trace ownership, right?
That's right. I mean, as I alluded to at the beginning of our chat today, real estate's a really great example. Property, land, it's a physical asset. You can go there, you can touch it, you can stand on it. It's a tangible asset. And there's paperwork associated with that land. It's very clear when the plot came into existence, if you like, and who the first owner was. And if you've ever been involved in property sales, you can get some of the very old deeds that are associated with the sale of the property that go back 10, 20, 30, 100 years, to establish way back when this was the owner and on this date it transferred to the next owner, and then following that there was a subsequent transfer. And you can literally see before your eyes how this happened. Not so with the intangible assets.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why we're talking about this. So I guess with the intangible assets like copyright, for example, if you're looking at, let's say back to the acquisition example, looking at acquiring rights in an organization where a lot of the value is in software, for example, then you'll want to make sure you're investigating the chain of title of the copyright in relation to that software to ensure that what you're purchasing has that asset in it, not something that might be exposed, I guess, to being ripped away at some point in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, the two big risks there is that you're paying valuable consideration for something that you're not ultimately going to be the owner of, and that's essentially just a waste of good money. And secondly, that you're exposing yourself to risk that the true owner is going to come knocking and claw that asset back for you. From you. And now, you potentially lost money and you're finding yourself in a situation where you're engaged in a bitter argument and potentially, litigation to try and hold on to that asset, or then to try to recover, from the person who sold it to you in the first place. And not a happy situation for anybody to be in.
And so that's also true if you think that you might be looking to sell your business at some point in the future, and a large component of the value of your organization sits in intellectual property. Be aware a buyer is going to be digging into this and going to be wanting to clarify from their own perspective that they believe that what they are buying into actually holds the asset that you say it does. And so this is a super important part of prep for sale, but it needs to be done well in advance, because the longer it's left, the harder it is to put our detective hats on and unwind the situation. But let's talk about that then, Robyn. In those instances where intellectual property is important, where we know there's a reason why the organisation needs to get clear on ensuring that it can validate and establish its chain of title to some third party. Maybe just talk very briefly about the process that we go through.
So the first thing that we're going to be doing is really sitting down with you, with our clients, and diving into, well, let's do an audit of your assets. What is the intellectual property that we're talking about here? Where's the value in the business? What is it that we need to examine? And then obviously we're going to identify, working with you, what those assets are, the ones that we need to investigate. Look, some of them, then there's not much value attributed to them, so we don't want to necessarily devote our time to digging into those ones, but there is going to be valuable assets for you. So then we're going to talk to you about, how those assets came into creation. Let's talk about the history of them, who you engaged to help you create them. Was it employees? Was it contractors? And we're going to want to hopefully start gathering physical evidence. So emails that you might have had to contractors, contractor agreements. If you've got employees that are creating content, we take a squiz at your employment agreement, the default position being that employees who have created content in the course of their employment, the owner is deemed to be the employer. But a quick squiz at the employment agreement to make sure it doesn't say anything different would be part of that process. And then from there, once we've really dug right into where did the assets come from, who created them, who had a hand in them, then we start looking at what's in place already to prove that ownership and to trace that chain. And then, we're identifying any gaps that might be there. If we do find gaps, hopefully we don't, but if we do, that's when we start looking at how we plug those holes. Is it retrospective assignment agreements, things of that nature?
And it might be licensing, and sometimes the reason for all of this might also be, setting up licenses into the future as well, so it might be prep work for getting, the foundations of the intellectual property in the business ready for growth plans that might include licensing. Yeah, absolutely. And so the one thing that I'd like to add for the IP audit perspective, it sounds really involved. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. So sometimes that whole IP audit process can be quite simple. Sometimes the IP audit process can be complicated if there's a complicated history. But I promise you, if it's complicated now, it will be 10 times more complicated if this is picked up at the time that you're looking at bringing on board investors, looking at exiting the business, you're looking at doing something else that's critical with the business and you haven't got it in place, because the earlier you get to this stuff and get it cleaned up, the easier it is.
Absolutely.
The longer it's left, the harder it is to find records, the harder it is to monitor all of this. And let's be frank, a very large component of organisations that we deal with that haven't had the proper legal advice in the beginning will have issues, won't have the right templates in place, won't have the right assignment clauses in place. And it's just once this is all set up, then it's something that you've got the right agreements to use going forward. And it's about keeping it clean as you grow rather than growing on a mess.
Absolutely, Jo. You've completely hit the nail on the head there. And, the other consideration is if you're looking at doing this sort of audit because you're considering a sale of your business, then the sooner the better, because, as you referred to earlier, a diligent purchaser is going to be making these investigations. And if these problems are uncovered and we need to try and do remedial work to fix it, you're potentially going to be holding up your completion of your sale. A purchaser is not going to want to go ahead with this paying any money until they can be assured that all of the documentation's in place. So, and the investigations could potentially take time. Purchaser could decide to walk away because it's just taking too long and you've lost yourself a sale. So the sooner that you turn your mind to these sorts of issues, get the IP audit done. Jo and I are very happy to help all of our listeners. Get us involved. We really like to get to know you. We really like to dive into your business, and help you avoid any of these sort of traps later on down the track.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, and then let's maybe just touch on a couple of very quick elements before we leave. I think some things that pop up time and time again is quite often there's a bit of a blurry line for founders. When founders have created some of the intellectual property, it can be really unclear whether or not those founders were the author themselves, whether they were employees at the time. And so this is a particular comment for, it can relate to prep for exit, but also in particular due diligence if you are an investor in or looking to acquire an organisation where IP is a large part of the value. it's the importance of us going back and ensuring that there's proper assignments from the founder in relation to some of that earlier created intellectual property. Would you agree with that, Robyn?
Oh, certainly, Jane. What we're looking at in that sort of context is, with your startup organizations, quite often it stems from an idea. It stems from the creator's idea. And they do a lot of significant development work in the very early stages, just as on their own, to try and get the idea off the ground before they start even considering things like incorporating companies and who the ultimate business owner is going to be. And all of that work is done, prior to the establishment of the registration of the companies. And so then if you're later asserting that, no, you actually created it as an employee of the company and that was your capacity at the time you created it, if we're talking about stuff that was created before the company even came into existence, that's not going to hold water. Yeah. And so in that instance, we want to make sure, very simple arrangement, that we've got an assignment from the founder in their own personal right to the company, which is important, even if the founder is still the sole director of the company, is still the sole shareholder of the company, because as we know, companies are legal entities in their own right. So, just putting into place that very basic assignment document, it can be retrospective, so we can refer to the earlier creation of works. And if there's a question, we can look at doing more of a confirmation type arrangement, and also capture future IP that may be created by the person in their own personal capacity as well.
Brilliant. Okay, wonderful. Look, I think we've traversed most of the issues. Do you think there's anything else that we've left out? I guess, perhaps one of the other things that we should say is if you're in acquisition mode, then these sorts of considerations are relevant, not just for due diligence, but also in the way that your acquisition contract is drafted. So, you just have to make sure that you're dealing with someone who understands from a legal perspective how to ensure that the right warranties are there, the right protections for you as an acquirer are there to ensure that, that the value in the IP is, in fact, within the organisation that you're purchasing, that asset value is there. So I guess that's one last thing. Is there anything else that you wanted to throw in, Robyn?
I just want to communicate to all of our lovely listeners, don't be scared by this. I know it does sound like a very intimidating process, and it does sound, we've obviously highlighted some of the really significant traps for people to be aware of. But I just want to say, don't be intimidated by it. It sounds like a scary process, but there is a very good system in place, and Joanna and I are both very experienced in dealing with these sorts of issues. So don't put it in the too hard basket. Give us a call, get in contact with us, and we can help untangle the mess for you. That's what we do. We're the problem solvers. So, we don't
like it. I'm going to adopt that, Robyn. Yes, we're the problem.
We're the problem solvers. And so obviously we want to solve little problems, not big problems. So come to us before the little problem grows.
They escalate.
Don't put it in the too hard basket.
Yeah. And I guess just leaving the conversation rounded out, there are a number of critical points for thinking about this. So if you're looking to prep for exit at some point in the future, if the value in your organisation if IP has a large component or holds a large component of value within your business, or if you are acquiring a business where IP, has a substantial component of the value, these are the times when you really need to be thinking about this IP ownership and confirming the chain of title. And as we said, the process is an IP audit, and then fixing the issues that are there if it's prep for exit, or if it's done by the current business owner, or dealing with the sale contract if it's in acquisition mode.
Absolutely.
That's it. Well, Robyn, we will make sure we link through to you in our show notes. And you, the listener, if you want to head over to our website, you'll see a link in the show notes for that. And at our website, you'll be able to get a transcript if you're the kind of person that just loves to go through this stuff in fine detail.
Oh, that's me, Jo.
She is our details lawyer. Absolutely. You'll also be able to book in a free discussion with Robyn or any of our other legal eagles via our website. So make sure you do that. If this is a topic that you think is relevant to your organisation, your exit or your acquisition, and we can have a discussion with you about how this topic might impact you. Well, that's it, Robyn. I just want to say a massive thank you today for coming onto the podcast.
Very welcome, Joanna. Always a pleasure.
I love it, love it, love it. And thank you to you, the listener, for listening in. You have been listening to the Deal Room podcast, proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. Aspect Legal has a number of great services that help businesses prepare for a sale or acquisition, to help them prepare in advance and to get transaction ready. We've also got a range of services to help guide businesses through the sale and acquisitions process. We work with clients both big and small and have different types of services depending on size and complexity. We provide a free consultation to discuss your proposed sale or acquisition. So see our show notes on how to book a time to speak with us, or head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Room podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.